Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 201. So today we're going to talk about the Bible. And specifically we're going to talk about some parts of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Torah. And the reason that we're talking about a piece of religious literature is because it's had a huge cultural significance. The men who wrote the Constitution read this too. And the laws that we're going to talk about today are also kind of universal. A lot of them show up in different constitutions all around the world. So we're going to talk about two different parts, and we're going to talk about why they have those laws and the lasting impact of those laws. So let's get started with a very short overview of where this book came from and the lasting impact that this sort of branch of religion has had all over the world. So one important thing to recognize about the text that we're going to read today is that it exists in multiple different religions. And that's because the three religions that it exists in all sort of came from the same place. So it's very complicated, and we're not going to get all the way into it, but essentially, there was one guy. His name was Abraham. He had two sons, and from those two sons, three different versions of kind of the same religion emerged. And the reason that this is important is because about 50% of the world's population practices one of these three branches. So the parts that we're going to read today have a lot to do with like ancient laws for getting along, but also ancient laws for practicing in a religious way that didn't like insult anybody and didn't insult God. And the reason, again, that they're so important is because so many people all over the world believe in it now and have believed in it historically. So the parts that we're going to read are relevant, again, all over the world, but they're also really important to the people that make the laws, especially the laws under which we are living. So I've been referring to these as biblical law, and that's kind of an umbrella term for all of the laws that are written down in this particular text. So the Bible that Christians use is essentially the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament is mostly the books that are considered to have been written by Moses. There's 5 different books, and there's not just 10 commandments, there's like 600 commandments. The New Testament is the part where Jesus comes in. So the Old Testament is also popular, again, in Islam and Christianity and in Judaism. And it has a very, very long personal historical history. So most of it was written down probably about like 200-ish BCE. Again, we don't know. And it's been written and changed ever since then. So it was largely like an oral tradition before it began to be written down. And of course, it's existed in lots of languages. So I don't advocate for a literal translation. First of all, it would be very difficult because so many languages, but also because it was written down so long after all of the events happened, and it's been edited by lots of different people with lots of different motivations. So the laws that we're going to look at today might not be precisely what they wrote down then. And that is tough, but it is an important thing to remember. So the question of who wrote this book is its own class, and not this class. Biblical history is fascinating, but that's not the important thing for us today. Essentially, it says in the book that Moses wrote them because God told him to, so that's kind of where we're going to go with this. In terms of who wrote it, again, that's kind of complicated. Like, who wrote it down by hand? We don't know. Who inspired it? It says God. Sometimes it says that Moses wrote them personally, and sometimes it says a priestly source, which again, kind of unclear, maybe Moses, maybe God. So who wrote this book is its own question for another class, but we're mostly going to talk about the ones that came directly from Moses. So that brings us to our next question, which is, who is Moses? And again, this is kind of complicated, but the important thing to know is that he's a really important religious prophet, again, for all 3 of those religions that we talked about. So there's a lot of like really good big stories about Moses. You've probably heard the one about when he was a baby and his mother floated him in a little basket down the river, and he was found by the Egyptian princess and raised by the royal family. Or you may have heard the stories about when he, as an adult, led the enslaved Israelites out of Egypt and went on the Exodus that we're going to talk about today. You might have seen the scene where he parts the Red Sea. He's a very important religious figure, and there's a lot of really good stories about him. But the important thing about him for today, and for today's reading, is that he was the source of a lot of these laws. He was the one that, in theory, God spoke to, and he was the one who wrote these things down, and he was like the leader of the people who were traveling around. So who is he? I don't know, he lived a very long time ago, but the thing that's important is that he was central to a lot of these religions, especially these religions that are so popular today all around the world. The other thing that I wanted to show you before we start looking at the text is what they're talking about when they talk about the Exodus. So basically the story goes that Moses led the Israelites around this Exodus for 40 years. They left Egypt, they went all the way down the Sinai Peninsula to Mount Sinai itself, and then they kind of wandered over there for a little while. And the thing that's important to remember is that a lot of these laws are important to people who are in the desert. Sometimes they're really quite central to survival. Sometimes they're interpersonal, but sometimes they're just really practical. The other important thing to remember is that 40 is a very important number. There's a lot of repeating numbers in biblical texts. 7 is one of them, 40 is another one. So if you think about traveling through the desert for 40 years, some of these laws might make more sense. So now we begin with the section with the 10 Commandments. And how they got the 10 Commandments is a little tricky. There's actually 2 versions of the same story in the same book. Version 1 has God sort of yelling out of a cloud at Moses, and then Moses writes them down the next day. Version 2 has Moses climbing up Mount Sinai with some other guys too. While he's up there, which again, they're there for 40 days, 40, very important. While they're up there, God hands them the 10 Commandments on 2 tablets. So again, there's multiple conflicting versions, and I think that what that really means is that how they came into being doesn't matter, what they are is what matters. So the 10 Commandments themselves are, again, in the stories, written on 2 stones. And this is what they might have looked like. Again, we don't know. How big were the stones? What language were they written in? Probably some sort of Paleo-Hebrew, maybe some sort of ancient Yemenite, maybe some sort of hieroglyphics. We're not sure. Was it 5 and 5? We don't know. Was it 10 on one and the same 10 on the other? Maybe. There's a theory that it might have been, because it was very common at the time when you made a treaty for both people to take a physical copy away with them. So we don't know for sure what exactly the stones looked like, but they're very popular to imagine. You've probably seen some really nice paintings of them. So the 10 Commandments themselves are old. The commandments were, again, in theory, written on stone. Here is a picture of the oldest known copy that's still like in a physical existence, which I think is kind of cool. But the really interesting thing about the commandments was that they had their own box, and this was very specific. So here you see the Ark of the Covenant. And you've probably heard about this. So even though there's very little detail about the tablets on which the commandments were written, there was a lot of detail about how they were supposed to be carried around. So the Ark of the Covenant is very specifically laid out, how big it is and how wide it is and what it should look like. But basically the whole thing was supposed to be gilded, and then there's 4 rings so that it could be carried by 4 people. You're supposed to put the tablets inside and then cover the whole thing with a cloth. So this was important because, again, they were traveling, and you needed a way to bring your commandments with you. So you've probably, again, seen a lot of really beautiful portraits of the way that they carried it around. Another interesting thing about it is that nobody knows where it is. So if you're an archaeologist, you might go look for it. There's some theories about where it might be. So if you do find the Ark of the Covenant, please let us know. But also, don't open it. You're not really supposed to open it, and you might know this if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. When they opened it, all the Nazis' faces melted. So if you do find it, please tell someone, but don't open it. So here are the 10 Commandments themselves. As you might notice, some of them are very simple, and some of them are much more complex. So we'll go through the more complex ones more carefully on different slides. But another thing that I wanted to mention was that you might have noticed, if you read them out loud especially, that there was a sort of repetitive pattern. And this is really common in oral tradition and in storytelling. It really helps the listener to have these patterns and these cadences. So if you read it out loud, you've probably seen that happen. The other thing to remember is that we are sort of emerging from a polytheistic tradition into a monotheistic tradition. And what that means is that a lot of the early religions, again, cross-culturally, all around the world, have multiple gods. There'll be like a god for the moon, and a god for the sun, and for war, and for death. But the monotheistic religions have only the one god. So you may, again, have noticed that there's a lot of repetition involving there being one God, and he's the only God, and he's a jealous God. And that's because people were sort of switching from the polytheistic tradition into the monotheistic tradition, so it had to be repeated over and over that there's just the one God. So, the first one. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Again, this is the transition from the polytheistic to the monotheistic. They had to drive that part home. Number 2, Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. So this one can be a little bit confusing. So let's look at the long version. The long version says, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. Pretty comprehensive. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So again, there's kind of a lot going on here. One thing that's important to remember is that it's okay if you make statues, you just can't bow down to them. So what this means is that you can make art that honors God, you can make those gigantic Gothic cathedrals, you can make a golden cow if you want, you just can't love it more than you love God. And that is because, as you can see, Old Testament God is a very jealous God. This is like the angry, wrathful version of God. New Testament God is a lot softer and nicer, but Old Testament God is pretty hardcore. So Old Testament God, very jealous, very serious about I am the only God part. So when you read this part about the graven images, that's kind of what they mean. They don't want you to make an idol the way that, again, people used to in polytheistic religions. They want you to only worship one. So, number 3, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So you probably heard this one when people say like, oh my God, or I swear to God. Not supposed to do that. In part, the idea behind this one was that you're not supposed to use the power of God for your own purposes. You're not supposed to like have him back you up in a way that he didn't agree to. You can say that you're going to do something, but you can't like kind of lie and say that God will help you. The 4th one, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Okay, again, this one gets quite complicated. So let's look at the longer version, which says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So one of the creation stories in the Bible says that on the first day he did this, on the second day he did this, etc., etc. It goes for 6 days, and then on the 7th day he rested. So keeping the 7th day holy has a huge range of how people practice that. In some versions it's like some light prayer, and in some versions you don't press buttons. So the degree to which you keep the Sabbath day holy is hugely variable, but it is important and it is in there that you're supposed to rest. And so too are the people who work for you, and the animals who work for you, and your children. All of that is very important. So not just you rest, everybody rest. The next few are pretty simple and self-explanatory. Number 5, honor thy father and thy mother. This one does get a little complicated in practice, like to what extent do you honor your father and mother? Do you do everything they say or not? That one can get complicated. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. Solid. Again, there can be translation issues, whether it's kill or murder, and that does become important in a legal sense. And also whether it means humans becomes important in a legal sense. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Solid, solid. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. Solid, loving it. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Now this one, also very interesting. This is one of the reasons that we have people swear on a Bible when they're giving a testimony in a court case. In part because we want to be sure that they know that we're serious here, and in part because there has to be a place where we tell the truth. And very often that place is the witness stand. So when it says very specifically you cannot bear false witness, that's one of the reasons we make people touch the Bible and say it at the same time. Number 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Okay, so the coveting one gets pretty complicated as well. So again, here's the long version of that one. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And again, this one is hard. It's a really interesting sort of interpersonal rule, but the idea is basically be content with what you have and don't covet the things that your neighbor has. It has a lot to do with not stealing, because it typically is the first step. My favorite part of this is that it mentions the donkey, and in some translations it says ass, which is always funny to children who are in church. So the coveting, again, don't do it no matter what. So within these 10 commandments, we end up with essentially 3 kinds of laws. And we'll see this repeated again as we continue forward. But basically, there are the religious laws, the ones that essentially are only about God. There are the interpersonal laws, which have to do with how we treat other humans. And there are the property laws, which have to do with how we treat like tangible goods. So this again is going to come up over and over. On the one hand, there's just the religious parts, which might not translate to a constitution anyway, but the other parts do tend to show up in multiple constitutions, in part because they're kind of similar all around the world, don't steal, don't murder, but in part because these are the ones that made it into so many other legal traditions. So keep these 3 types of laws in mind, because next we're going to look at the long list of laws that happens in Leviticus. So now we're going to look at the laws from Leviticus. And we're not going to look at all of the laws from Leviticus because there are a lot, and not all of them have the sort of cultural significance of the ones that we're going to look at today. So these were, again, in theory, written during the time that Moses was taking people around on their exodus. They were probably started in about 1400 BCE and finished in about 500 BCE, but again, who knows? It takes a long time to write these things down. So what we're going to talk about are the ones that mostly they used for getting along in groups. The source of these laws, again, mostly credited to Moses or the priestly source. So we can pretty safely assume that they were written down by the leaders in order to get people to stay alive and get along so that they could establish a new community when they were finished with their exodus. So let's start with the very first part. So we begin with another repetition about God being the only God. Again, Old Testament God, very jealous. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, 'Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy.'" So essentially we're starting with the idea that you need to promulgate. You need to get out there and tell everybody how to behave, and specifically you need to tell them to behave in a godlike way. So this gives us a pretty good indication that these rules are not just for one person, and they're not really just for like this specific religious tribe. They're kind of for everybody. He says, go out there and tell them all that I said they have to behave. The next one has a lot to do with, again, the sort of interpersonal laws with family. Each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. So again, there's a lot of focus on respecting your elders, and that's true in a lot of cultures. Again, that's cross-culturally, universally kind of a thing. We mentioned the Sabbath here again. This has a lot to do with resting, and it has a lot to do with religious observance. And this is our first instance of seeing the repetition of the phrase, I am the Lord your God, at the end. We're going to see that over and over. Again, this has a strong linguistic tradition. When you read it out loud, it makes it sound way better. The next one. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. So here again, we're talking about the graven images, and it's not about don't build statues, it's about don't like those statues better than me. So you're allowed to build things, you're allowed to make metal calves. There's so many gorgeous paintings throughout the ages, throughout like centuries of people with their metal calves. And again, you're allowed to make beautiful things so long as they honor God and don't replace God. This next one veers off into really practical territory. So it was pretty common at the time to offer burnt offerings to God. And so essentially you would bring something, usually an animal, but something that had value. And then you would destroy it. And so destroying something that was valuable to you as a sacrifice meant that you really meant that sacrifice. So you wouldn't make a burnt offering of something you didn't want anyway. You would make a burnt offering of something that was meaningful to you and meaningful to your tribe. However, sometimes in this tradition, you could make a burnt offering and then eat it too. So one of the things that you'll notice is that this one has a lot to do with religion, but it also has a lot to do with practicality. So when you sacrifice a fellowship offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. So when you make an offering, do it right. It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it or on the next day. Anything left until the third day must be burned up. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it is impure and will not be accepted. Whoever eats it will be held responsible because they have desecrated what is holy to the Lord. They must be cut off from their people. So this is actually very practical advice. If you make a burnt offering, and this is kind of what the altars for burnt offerings look like, it might look familiar because it's very similar to a barbecue grill. If you do something like that, you should eat it on the first day, if not the second day. You can't really eat it the third day because they hadn't invented refrigeration yet. So this is actually very practical advice. If you make a burnt offering, eat it that day because that's when it's the freshest and the least full of bacteria. If you have to, eat it the next day, but by the third day, since we don't have antibiotics and we haven't, again, invented refrigeration yet, you probably shouldn't eat it. So this is kind of religious advice and practical advice at the same time, which is something we're going to see repeated a few times. This next one is both interpersonal and practical. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So here, it's essentially saying, leave some stuff for the people that don't have any stuff. When you're harvesting, leave a little bit at the edges. When you're getting your grapes, maybe don't go back a second time. And there's this acknowledgement that there are always going to be poor people, and there are always going to be travelers and foreigners and people who haven't got the means to provide for themselves yet. So if you are so lucky as to have a harvest, especially a bountiful harvest, make sure that you leave some for the people who might not have that option. This next one is a pretty great set of rules. These are pretty unobjectionable. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Solid. Most constitutions that we're going to see and most of the rules for sort of getting along with other humans include these things. Again, you might notice some repetitions from the Ten Commandments. That's not necessarily unusual. Those were sort of wrapped up in these. But these are solid. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't deceive one another. And remember, don't deceive one another is sort of like the opposite side of don't lie. It has to do with like lying by omission. So it doesn't mean don't outright lie. It also means don't withhold information or don't like twist the information to better suit your purposes. So these three, very sensible. This next one might also sound familiar. This one, again, is about taking the Lord's name in vain. So it says, do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So again, this one has a lot to do with using God's power to back up you when God said he wouldn't do that. It isn't necessarily about saying, oh my God, or something like that. It's more about saying, I swear to God I will do this thing, or God is going to help me kill you. Like you're not supposed to do that. God didn't sign up for that. Where we see it most often, especially for those of you who grew up in religious households or religious communities, has a lot to do with saying like, oh my gosh, or something like that. So you may have seen memes like this where you're supposed to not say the Lord's name. And not saying the Lord's name does have significance in several different religions. But here it's mostly about don't use me when I didn't agree to what you said. So these next two are more interpersonal. They have to do with how to get along with members of your community. So the first one says, do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Solid. Don't give them a false bill of goods. Don't say you're going to give them something and then give them something else. Basically, do not defraud your neighbors and also don't outright rob them. The next one is also about the people that you hire, the people that have less power than you. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. So in a lot of cultures, if somebody works for you during the day, you pay them at the end of the day. These days, we tend to have a way different pay schedule. It's usually like bi-weekly. But depending on the kind of work you do, it's perfectly fair to expect to be paid at the end of the day for the work you did that day. And so holding back those wages, especially promising to pay and then not paying, not good. The next one is about how to deal with members of your community who might have disadvantages. So basically, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. So essentially, don't mess with people, especially people who might be blind or who might be deaf or who might be, again, sort of physically disadvantaged or differently abled. Basically, take care of every member of your community, of your flock, and don't mess with the people, even if you feel like they're different from you. This next one should sound familiar, even though, of course, these are coming from very different sources, but Aristotle talked about this as well, and we see this in the Constitution as well, and it has to do with legal practices, and essentially due process. So it says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. So again, this one comes up all of the time. We saw this in the Constitution. You can't judge people differently based on how much wealth they have or how much power they have. Essentially, everyone is equal under the law. And that is such an old rule for getting along that it's this old. The next one I think is also kind of interesting. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. So remember, slander is when you say it, and libel is when you write it down, and both of them have to be untrue to be a problem. So the thing here is essentially don't gossip, but don't especially say untrue gossip about the people who are part of your community. This one is a struggle, as you've probably noticed, especially belonging to a small community. But this is a really, really important one because, as again, you may have noticed, this can destroy a community. Having people spreading lies, having people spreading malicious gossip can tear a community apart quite quickly. And if you are already strangers in a strange land and you're traveling, that's dangerous. So if you belong to a community that you want to keep whole and safe and healthy, don't slander. The next part, do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Again, solid advice. This is often why we have things like building codes or seatbelt laws or drunk driving. In theory, you are responsible for your neighbor. You are responsible for the other members of your community, so just don't do anything that might harm them. Pretty solid. This next one I think is especially interesting, and again has something to do with Aristotle. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. So it's kind of like if you see something, say something. The idea here is that you don't want to carry the burden of being mad at somebody or hating somebody or knowing that somebody did something terrible. You want to address it. You want to go talk to that person, speak frankly, and tell them that what they've done is unacceptable, and tell them what they've done bothers you. And I think this is a really good example of a way to sort of keep members of your community honest. If you've ever heard of the squeaky step principle, it's this idea that if there's somebody in your community that everybody knows is kind of dangerous, you will learn to avoid them, the same way that you will learn to hop over a squeaky step in your house. But if a new person comes along, they don't know that they need to avoid that person, and that can be really dangerous. So what they're saying is don't let that happen. If there's someone in your community who is dangerous, who is doing something wrong, tell them, rebuke them, bring charges against them. Essentially, don't just sit around hating them, actively go out and make them stop doing the thing that they're doing and make them face judgment for their actions. Next, we have a little bit of a counterpoint to that argument, which is essentially that yes, you need to be honest with people, but also you need to be kind. So it says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So here is saying, yes, you need to honestly rebuke them, but also, yes, you need to allow them to make up for it. You need to give them forgiveness at the end of the day. So the thing that I think is really important about this one is the concept of loving your neighbor as yourself. That's hard. That's hard for humans. Americans are not doing a great job at that right now. We are so centralized, right? And we're so individualized that it can be very difficult to remember that even though our neighbor is not us, they do still deserve love. I think that's one of the hardest principles to hold to regardless of your religion. This next part is mostly practical. It's pretty much about how to make food, how to grow food, and how to have success at it, but it isn't necessarily applicable to 21st century life. So it says, first, keep my decrees. Second, do not make different kinds of animals. And this one is pretty much just practical. As cute as that pug bunny is, it's not going to happen. And most of the time, if you try to make two different animals, either nothing will happen or some sort of genetic deformity will happen. Either way, well, let's just not. Do not plant your field with two different kinds of seed. Again, kind of the same principle. The idea is you can't make a new plant necessarily by planting two seeds next to each other. But it is actually kind of a common practice in gardening to grow two seeds next to each other because some plants really help each other grow. And sometimes they give nutrients to the soil that both plants need. So the idea behind that verse is not necessarily don't have a garden with different things in it. It's more like don't expect to grow tobacco and tomato at the same time into one plant. The next part we didn't really keep with either. Do not wear clothing woven of 2 different kinds of material. No one is quite sure what this part is supposed to mean. It might be kind of a metaphor. It might be about like the tensile strength of the fabric, but regardless, this is one of the ones that we have largely let go of. It's an example of the things that they wrote down that we're not quite sure how to do in the modern world. So there's a bunch of those in Leviticus, and this is just one example. This next one gets complicated. And even though it involves people, it's really about property. This is a property law. So it says, if a man sleeps with a female slave who is promised to another man, but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. So essentially, adultery is bad, but if you sleep with someone's wife, that's one crime. If you sleep with someone's slave, that's a whole different crime. Because the first one is an interpersonal crime, and the second one is a property crime. Yet they're not to be put to death, because she had not been freed. The man, however, must bring a ram to the entrance of the tent for a meeting for a guilt offering to the Lord. With the ram of the guilt offering, the priest is to make an atonement for him before the Lord for the sin he has committed, and his sin will be forgiven. So essentially, if you do commit this grievous property crime against another man, the women are, of course, not the problem here, you have to do a pretty serious penance. You have to bring a ram, and a ram is important because usually you only have one ram. You got like a bunch of sheep, but only one boy sheep. And you have to bring that ram to the church and like publicly apologize, and the priest apologizes on your behalf, and you kill the ram, probably you eat the ram, but either way, you're giving up something valuable to you to show penance for having taken something valuable from someone else. So this one is complicated, and again, not necessarily applicable to the 21st century, but it was important at the time, because ownership of slaves was important and ownership of sheep was important. So it might not make a whole lot of sense, but it was important at the time. With this next one, we're getting back into the practical aspects, especially of how to grow food for yourself. So this one is about fruit. When you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat its fruit. In this way the harvest will be increased. I am the Lord your God. So this is just solid horticultural advice. Fruit trees don't really begin producing for a few years. They have to grow, they have to get all fat, they have to get all healthy, and this is just a thing that is true. Fruit's not really very good until the tree is like 4 or 5 years old. So again here, this is very practical. This next one, also very practical. Do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Again, this was not about like, how do you prefer your steak? This was about, we don't have antibiotics or refrigeration yet. So if you have wild meat and you don't know where it's been or how it's been preserved, you're going to want to cook it really hard. You don't want to eat a medium rare steak from a cow that never had any antibiotics. The next part is kind of a weird addition to this, but okay. Do not practice divination or seek omens. Again, this is partly about the polytheistic and monotheistic changeover. So in the polytheistic tradition, there were a lot of like spiritists and like omens and witches, kind of, you know, there was a lot of divination. There was a lot of reading of signs to try to figure out what the gods wanted. And so what he's trying to say here is, don't try to guess what I want. I told you what I want. And don't practice these weird polytheistic things that I told you to get rid of. So I don't know why it's in the same verse with the meat, but basically it means don't practice religion the way you used to. Practice religion the way I'm telling you to now. These next two have lost a lot of their cultural significance, depending on what variety of religion you practice and how serious you are about it. So it says in 1927, do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip the edges off your beard. And this was not necessarily practical, this was more about recognizing each other. So that if you looked, for instance, at another man, you could tell if he was practicing the same religion that you were practicing. You may have seen this. A lot of ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic Jews still practice this. The next one is about marking your body. So it says, do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord. So again, he's essentially arguing don't practice religion the way you used to. So it used to be relatively common that in a process of mourning, you would mark up your own body. It would be sort of symbolic of the grief that you were feeling. And also tattoos used to be sometimes a matter of property, sometimes a matter of grief, but either way, it was not necessarily something they wanted to bring to the monotheistic religions. So basically the argument here is not necessarily your body is a temple, although that will come up later. It's more like don't do the stuff you used to do when you were doing that other religion. This next part is kind of interpersonal and kind of a property crime. Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. Feels like pretty solid advice. It's kind of a slippery slope argument. Basically, if you make your daughter be a prostitute, then everybody will become a prostitute because that will be sort of the way of monetary exchange. But again, I think this is pretty good advice. I think we should keep this one. The next one should sound familiar. It's the Sabbath again. Observe my Sabbaths and have a reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So again, that one seventh day is supposed to be kept holy. Again, depending on how you worship, there's a lot of different variations. But also here he's referencing the literal physical sanctuary. Does it need to be physical? Not necessarily. There's a lot of talk about that in Judaism and in Christianity as well in regard to the sanctuary just being a gathering of humans. But reverence for the sanctuary is also important. You may remember when we were talking a little bit about St. Augustine, he noted that when Rome was getting sacked, a lot of the Romans hid in Christian churches and they were not harmed, which is part of giving people sanctuary. So this is, again, something that you probably heard lately with the concept of sanctuary cities, or just the very concept of like, my home is my sanctuary or something like that. So in this verse, the idea is observe the day that is holy and observe the place that is holy. So this has a lot to do with how you live your life on a sort of practical day-to-day basis. This next one is about divination again. Why isn't it next to the other verse about divination? Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. So again, he's saying don't go to other humans to ask them what I want. I told you what I want, just listen to me. The next one, again, also familiar in regard to the elders. Stand up in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I am the Lord. So you might have seen this one in practice when you're supposed to like stand up and give someone your seat on a train. You might have heard about this one if your own parents or elders told you to respect them. But the idea is essentially people who are older than you know things you don't know and worked hard to bring you into this world, so show them respect. This next one I think is especially timely and also especially difficult. Just in modern America, we're not doing a great job with this one. But it says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So the argument here is like, remember when we were on Exodus, we were foreigners. So when foreigners come to wherever we settle, be kind to them. And I think this is a really beautiful argument, that basically you probably aren't native born where you are right now. And I think this is a very hard thing for white Americans to remember because we are not native to this land. In fact, we treated the people who were native to this land very badly. And we continue to treat people who come to this land very badly. So this is a tough one. The argument here is essentially treat people as you would like to be treated, treat people as they might have treated you in the past, but it's hard to put into practice. So you may have seen signs about this up in people's neighborhoods, but it's one of the ones that I think is really beautiful and really timely and really hard to put into action. This one is also very practical. So this one has a lot to do with the lying and the cheating. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. So again, there's this reminder that you used to be slaves and you're not anymore, so like get it together. But there's also some sort of old-fashioned measurements that we don't use anymore. So for the record, an ephah is a dry measurement and it's like about 8-ish gallons, kind of like a basket. A hin is a wet measurement and it's about 5 liters, I don't have a measurement to show you. But the thing that's important here is not that you use these specific forms of measurement, but that you don't lie when you're measuring something, that you don't sell something that you say is heavier than it is or bigger than it is. So again, this is just pretty good advice for getting along. The next one is sort of the summation. It's this idea that I'm at the end of my list and I just want to remind you so you don't forget. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. So don't just continue to write them down, follow them. Again, this may sound kind of familiar. You can't just have virtue, you have to do virtue. So this is a pretty good summation of all the things that he said, and also this is one of my favorite depictions of the Christian God. So that was a lot of laws, which brings us to our next question, which is, did people follow those laws? And in large part, yes. Especially the ancient Jews who were traveling around, they needed these laws. They needed to survive. They needed to get along. So they followed these laws pretty carefully. There was also major penalties for not following these laws at the time. Like you could be kicked straight out of the tribe. So adherence to these laws was important, both on a survival level in some cases, like blood in the meat, and on a religious level in other cases, like doing religion correctly. Do modern people follow these laws? Kind of. So on the one hand, the stuff in the Ten Commandments is pretty clear, and the stuff in Leviticus also pretty clear. Like, don't murder, don't steal. We do follow those. On the other hand, a lot of the more specifically religious stuff we don't follow anymore. A lot of people have sort of shifted their practice of religion. So yes, there are some people who try to follow them literally, and yes, there are some people who follow them on a much looser basis. So even though a pretty significant portion of Americans consider themselves to be Christian, they don't necessarily do all the stuff. To be fair, in part, the New Testament kind of canceled out the Old Testament. So there was a new covenant formed with Jesus, which meant that all the old stuff didn't necessarily count anymore. So you don't necessarily have to keep with the stuff about like not weaving two fabrics together, because the covenant that Jesus brought was a whole different thing. So for Christians, it's not necessarily as important. For Jews, it's a little bit more important, but it's still not always followed precisely to the law. And for Muslims, again, it's still important, especially the original 10, but it's not always followed as precisely. So yes, we still follow some of these, like worldwide and specifically in America, but also no, we let go of a lot of the stuff, like we just don't really do burnt offerings anymore. So I think it would be fair to say that ancient people followed them much more closely than people of modern times. The other thing that's important to remember about the place of these laws in American society is that they are still super present, regardless of what you believe. So for instance, we've had a lot of court cases lately where people are trying to put the Ten Commandments in courthouses or trying to take the Ten Commandments back out of the courthouses. We've had a lot of religious pressure on certain laws, and in part, this is because we are heavily religious. So if you look at this graph, this is the religious makeup of the 116th Congress, which is the one that we have currently, and you'll notice that it's very, very Christian. It's broken up here into Protestant and Catholic, of course, but you'll notice that the Jewish and the Mormon and the other section is much, much smaller. So in a situation where the majority of our lawmakers are following a very specific religion, the study of that religion can become relevant. So if people are voting with a religious conscience, which very often they are, that religion transfers over to the Constitution. So that's why it's culturally important, regardless of what you believe. How does it impact your papers, you might ask? A solid question. So one thing I want you to consider for your Constitution is whether you want to involve religion. Historically, it's been a popular option. It's a very popular way to sort of like control the population and also to add a sort of adhesion to your population. Having everybody in your community believe in the same religion is very powerful and very like wholesome. That said, you don't have to have any religion at all. You might want to use some of the laws that we just talked about because again, some of them are universal. Don't steal, don't murder, but you don't have to. I just wanted you to know that sometimes laws that come from religion can bring a lot of cohesion to the community that you're trying to believe. So that ends our lecture on the Bible. I hope everyone is sufficiently insulted. There's just no way to talk about a religious text without crossing a certain amount of lines. But I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you, and I'll see you soon.